The sun was a hammer, and the desert was its anvil. For days, it had been beating down on the endless expanse of red dust and cracked earth, forging the world into something brittle and shimmering. The heat rose from the ground in waves that made the horizon tremble, blurring the line between the rust-colored sand and the bleached blue sky. What little life there was had turned inward, hiding from the glare. Sagebrush, gray and skeletal, clung to the dry soil. It sent a dusty perfume of decay. The only sound was the low, ceaseless hum of the wind as it scoured the landscape, carrying with it the grit that found its way into a man's eyes, his mouth, his soul. This was a land that did not welcome life. It tolerated it for a season, and then it took it back without ceremony. Through this furnace walked Clara. Her feet, once shod in sturdy leather boots, were now bare, the soles blistered and raw against the scorching ground. Each step was a fresh agony, a small, sharp cry swallowed by the immense silence. Her dress, a calico of faded blue that had once been her Sunday best, was torn at the hem and shoulder, stained with sweat and dirt. It clung to her thin frame, a useless shroud in the oppressive heat. Her lips were cracked and peeling, a testament to a thirst so profound it had gone past pain and settled into a dull, persistent ache in the back of her throat. She had long ago stopped seeing the world clearly. The sun had burned the detail from everything, leaving only shapes and shadows. The distant mesas swam in the haze, looking more like mirages than solid rock. She was walking blind, guided only by a flicker of instinct that told her to keep moving forward, though forward had no meaning here. She was fleeing. The memory of it was a brand on her mind, hotter than the sun. It was not a single image, but a collage of them. The sour smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies. The splintered wood of a saloon door kicked off its hinges. The glint of a belt buckle in the lamplight. There were faces, bearded and cruel, their eyes promising a specific kind of violence that had nothing to do with justice. And there were the voices, the women's whispers that were sharper than any knife, carving words into her skin. Wicked, fallen, thief. She had run from them all, from the hands that sought to claim her and the town that had already condemned her. She had run until her horse, a good mare named Daisy, had given out. The memory of Daisy's fall was the clearest of all. The animal's shuddering breath, the way its legs had buckled, the final, soft sigh as its great heart ceased to beat. She had stayed with the body for hours, stroking its neck, her tears turning to mud on its dusty coat. Leaving the horse had felt like leaving the last piece of herself behind. Now, she was just a ghost, a specter of the woman she had been, drifting through purgatory. She thought she heard the sound of a child's laughter on the wind, a cruel trick of her heat-addled mind. She stumbled toward it, her arms outstretched, a hoarse cry catching in her throat. But there was nothing there. There was only the sun and the sand and the silence. Her strength, a reservoir she had thought bottomless, finally ran dry. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed in a heap beside the winding scar of a riverbed that had not seen water in a generation. The red dust rose up to meet her, soft and final, and the world went black. Eli Carson rode with his head down, the brim of his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the relentless glare. His horse, a steady buckskin named Buster, plodded onward with the grim determination of an animal that knew its job and expected no joy from it. They were moving south, pushing a string of 4 pack mules laden with supplies for a cattle outfit working the lower range. It was a lonely job, but Eli preferred it that way. The quiet of the plains suited the quiet in his own soul. He had heard enough shouting in his life to last him an eternity. He was a man carved from the same hard material as the land he traveled. His face was weathered, browned by the sun, with lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting at distant horizons. His hands, resting easy on the pommel of his saddle, were calloused and capable. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life spent in harsh places, where wasted energy could mean the difference between living and dying. He almost missed her. From a distance, she was just a dark shape against the pale earth. a bundle of discarded rags, or perhaps a dead calf. His first instinct, born of long and bitter experience, was to keep riding. Trouble had a way of finding a man in the open, and a body on the trail was always the beginning of a story he had no interest in being a part of. He had his own ghosts. He did not need to take on anyone else's. He nudged Buster forward, his eyes fixed on the hazy line of the mountains that marked his destination. But he could not shake the image. It was the wrong shape for a calf, too small, and there was something about the way the tattered blue cloth fluttered in the breeze, a fragile sign of something that had once been human, against his better judgment, against every cynical lesson the world had taught him. He pulled gently on the reins. "Whoa, boy," he murmured, and the horse stopped, grateful for the pause. Eli swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the soft sand. He walked toward the shape, his hand resting near the butt of the Colt revolver holstered on his hip. He was not a man who trusted easily. As he drew closer, he saw that it was a woman. Her face was turned away from him, half buried in the dust. Her hair, a dark chestnut brown, was matted and tangled with bits of scrub brush. He could see the sharp line of her shoulder blades through the thin fabric of her dress. She was dangerously still. He knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. He checked her neck for a pulse, his rough fingers pressing gently against her skin, which was hot and dry as a stone. He felt it then, a faint, thready beat, as fragile as a bird's wing. She was alive, barely. A sigh escaped him, one of weary resignation. He had gone and done it now. He had gotten involved. He stood and walked back to his horse, grabbing his canteen from the saddle horn. He returned to her side and cradled her head in his arm, lifting her just enough to bring the metal lip of the canteen to her mouth. Her head was heavy, a dead weight. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble, unused to softness. He tilted the canteen, and a trickle of water ran over her cracked lips and down her chin. At first, there was no response. Then, a faint flicker of her eyelids. A low moan escaped her throat, a sound of pure misery. He poured another small measure of water, and this time, her lips parted slightly, a primal instinct taking over. She swallowed, a painful, rasping sound. Her eyes opened, but they were unfocused, clouded with delirium. They stared right through him, seeing something else entirely, something from the world of fever and shadow she inhabited. Her voice, when it came, was a dry whisper, a rustle of dead leaves. "I've been waiting so long." The words hung in the hot, still air, strange and unsettling. He had expected a cry for help, a question, a plea for more water. Not this. It was as if she had been expecting him, or someone like him, to appear out of the shimmering heat. He looked at her face, truly looked at it for the first time, even beneath the grime and the sun-scald. He could see the fine cut of her bones, the dark sweep of her lashes against her cheek. She was young, younger than he was, and she was terrified. The fear was there, deep in her unfocused eyes, a raw and primal thing that his own soul recognized. He gently lowered her head back to the ground and stood up, surveying the landscape. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal shades of orange and red. There was no question of moving on now. Not with her in this state. He would have to make camp. He worked with the quiet efficiency of a man who had made 1,000 camps in 1,000 lonely places. He unsaddled his horse and the mules, rubbing them down before picketing them where they could graze on the sparse, dry grass. He gathered greasewood and dead mesquite for a fire, the crackle of the flames a welcome sound as dusk settled and the vast, empty silence of the desert night began to press in. He laid out his bedroll near the fire and then turned his attention back to the woman. He used a corner of his saddle blanket to gently wipe the dust from her face, revealing the painful sunburn across her nose and cheeks. Her feet were a mess, cut and swollen. He washed them as best he could with the last of the water from his canteen, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such rough hands. She did not stir again. As darkness fell completely, the desert transformed. The oppressive heat gave way to a sudden, biting chill. The sky became a canvas of impossible black, strewn with a million sharp, cold stars. Eli sat by the fire, nursing a cup of coffee he had brewed, watching the woman sleep. The flames cast flickering shadows across her face, making her look even more fragile, more lost. He found himself in a debate with the harshest parts of himself. The practical side of him, the survivor, argued that he should leave her at first light. He had a contract to fulfill, supplies to deliver. A woman, especially one in this much trouble, was a complication he could not afford. She was a stray, and strays always brought wolves. He had learned that lesson in the war, and in the years that followed. Kindness was a currency that often bought you nothing but a knife in the back. But as he watched her, another voice, one he had long tried to silence, spoke up. He saw the way she flinched in her sleep, a small, convulsive jerk, as if fending off a phantom blow. He saw the faint, pale line of a scar near her hairline, and he remembered her eyes, the raw terror he had seen there. It was a look he knew well. He had seen it on the faces of young soldiers before a charge, on men who knew they were about to die. He had seen it in the mirror on nights when the whiskey did not work. Something inside him, a rusty and long-neglected hinge of compassion, refused to let him ride away. He could not leave her to the buzzards and the coyotes. He could not, whatever sins he had on his soul, he would not add this one to the ledger. An hour before midnight, she began to murmur. The words came in broken pieces, disjointed fragments rising from the depths of her fever dream. "No, please," she whispered, her head thrashing from side to side on the blanket. Eli moved closer, sitting on his heels beside her. He did not touch her, did not want to frighten her. He just listened. They said I was wicked," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep and pain. Hollow Creek, such a dark place. The name of the town was a curse on her lips. "He wouldn't let me be." There was a long pause, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the distant yip of a coyote. "The men, they were hunting." Her breathing grew ragged, her hands clenching into fists. "Said I stole it, but I never. Eli listened in silence, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Each broken phrase was a piece of a puzzle he did not want to solve. A saloon girl, most likely. A powerful man who thought he owned her. A town full of hypocrites eager to cast the first stone. It was a story as old as the dirt beneath his boots, but hearing it from her, in these whispered, desperate confessions, made it feel new and raw. Her pain was a living thing in the small circle of firelight, and it woke his own ghosts. As she spoke of men hunting her, his mind drifted back to a place he never wanted to go. A damp forest in Tennessee, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. He was not much more than a boy then, wearing a blue uniform that was 2 sizes too big. He remembered the face of a Confederate soldier, a boy even younger than him, with fear-widened eyes, his hands raised in surrender, and he remembered the order from his sergeant. No prisoners. He had fired his rifle. The memory was as sharp and clear as if it had happened yesterday. The sound of the shot, the look of surprise on the boy's face, the way he had crumpled to the ground like a discarded doll. That boy had haunted him for 10 years. He was the reason Eli sought the silence of the plains, the reason he kept moving, the reason he knew that words like good and bad were just stories people told themselves to sleep at night. He was no better than the men who had hunted this woman. He had just worn a different uniform. Clara fell silent again, her breathing evening out into the shallow rhythm of exhausted sleep. Eli stayed where he was, staring into the flames. The night felt heavy, weighted down by the sum of their unspoken sorrows. The vast, indifferent desert seemed to be listening, its ancient, stony heart absorbing the pain of the 2 small, broken creatures huddled by a fire. A man haunted by what he had done, and a woman haunted by what had been done to her. Chance had thrown them together. 2 pieces of driftwood caught in the same slow, merciless current. He did not know where the current was taking them, but as he looked at the sleeping woman, He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would not be leaving her behind. Not yet. The first light of dawn was a cruel kindness. It painted the eastern sky in soft shades of rose and gray, but it brought with it the promise of another day's relentless heat. Clara woke to a world scrubbed clean of shadows, the desert floor stretching out in every direction like a pale, dusty sea. Her body was a map of aches. Every muscle protested as she pushed herself into a sitting position, her head throbbing with the dull rhythm of dehydration. For a moment, she was disoriented, the memory of the last 24 hours a feverish blur. Then she saw him. Eli was already awake, standing by the smoldering remains of the fire. He was looking east, his silhouette a hard, dark line against the brightening sky. He seemed as much a part of the landscape as the weathered rocks and skeletal cacti, a man who had been shaped by silence and solitude. He had not noticed she was awake, and in that unguarded moment, she studied him. He was not a handsome man in the way the dandies who passed through Hollow Creek were handsome. His face was too lean, his jaw too square, the lines around his eyes too deep, but there was a steadiness to him, a solid, grounded presence that she found herself clinging to, as a drowning person might cling to a piece of driftwood. He was real in a way that nothing else had been for a very long time. He turned then, his eyes meeting hers. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet acknowledgement. "The coffee is hot," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound in the morning stillness. He gestured with his chin toward a tin pot resting on the coals. She nodded, the simple act sending a wave of dizziness through her. She felt a flush of shame rise in her cheeks. She was a burden, a half-dead stray he had found in the dirt, and now he was saddled with her. "I can travel," she said, the words coming out as a dry croak. She tried to stand, to prove it, but her legs trembled and refused to hold her. She sank back down, humiliated. Eli walked over and handed her a cup of coffee. It was black and bitter, but the warmth of it was a balm to her soul. He watched her for a long moment, his gaze neutral, unreadable. "You will ride," he stated. It was not a question or an offer. It was a fact. "I will walk." "But your supplies, your mules," she began to protest, but he cut her off with a single, sharp look. "The mules will follow Buster, and Buster will follow me. It is settled." He turned away, beginning the swift, efficient process of breaking camp. He moved with a purpose that left no room for argument. Clara drank her coffee in silence, a strange mix of gratitude and resentment churning within her. She was not used to being cared for, and she was not used to being ordered. He helped her onto his horse, his hands firm and impersonal on her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. The contact, brief as it was, sent a jolt through her. His strength was palpable, a contained and quiet power. She felt small and fragile in his saddle, her tattered dress a stark contrast to the sturdy, well-oiled leather. He adjusted the stirrups for her without a word, then took Buster's reins in his hand and started walking, his stride long and even. The pack mules, tethered together, fell into line behind them. They moved out into the vast, sun-drenched emptiness, a tiny, lonely caravan in an indifferent world. The day was a trial by fire. The sun climbed the sky, a white-hot coin that seared the land and bleached the color from everything. There was no shade, no respite. Eli walked on, his pace never faltering, his hat pulled low. He seemed impervious to the heat, a man made of leather and wire. Clara, perched atop the horse, felt her strength waning with each passing hour. The rhythmic sway of the horse's gait was hypnotic, and she had to fight to stay conscious, her head drooping, her body slumping forward. Once, when she nearly slipped from the saddle, Eli's hand shot out and steadied her leg, his touch firm and brief. "Stay with me," he said, his voice low but insistent. His eyes, when she looked down at him, were clear and focused, and she found a sliver of his strength to hold on to. Survival became a silent partnership, a ritual of shared hardship. Every hour, he would stop and give her water from his canteen, a carefully measured amount. He would drink less himself, a fact she noted with a pang of guilt. They did not speak. The effort was too great, the air too hot and dry to waste on words. The world was reduced to the basics: the plodding of hooves, the creak of leather, the sting of sweat in her eyes, and the steady, relentless presence of the man walking beside her. He was her anchor in that shimmering, hostile world. Late in the afternoon, the sky to the west turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind, which had been a hot breath, began to pick up, carrying with it a fine, stinging dust. Eli stopped and scanned the horizon, his body tense. "Storm," he said, the single word sharp with urgency. Before Clara could fully comprehend what was happening, the world was blotted out. A wall of red dust descended upon them, a roaring, suffocating cloud that turned day into a hellish twilight. The wind howled, tearing at her clothes, whipping her hair across her face. Buster whinnied in panic, and the mules brayed nervously. Eli was a blur of motion. He pulled her down from the horse, his arms securely around her waist. "Here!" he yelled over the roar of the wind, pushing her down into the meager shelter of a rocky outcrop. He pulled a heavy canvas tarp from one of the mule packs and threw it over them, creating a small, dark cave against the fury of the storm. They huddled together underneath, the wind screaming outside, the canvas snapping and cracking like a whip. Clara trembled, not just from the sudden chill the storm had brought, but from the proximity to him. His shoulder was pressed against hers, his arm a solid weight around her. She could smell the scent of him, dust, leather, and something else, something uniquely his, in that small, dark space, with the world trying to tear itself apart outside. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, safe. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world coated in a fresh layer of red dust. The air was still, the silence profound. They crawled out from under the tarp, blinking in the strange, muted light. A few miles ahead, a lone mesquite tree stood, its gnarled branches a dark silhouette against the sky. It looked like a miracle. "We will rest there," Eli said, his voice hoarse from the dust. The shade of the mesquite was thin, but it was the first real shade they had seen all day. It felt like a cathedral. Eli gave her the last of the water and a piece of dry jerky, which she chewed on slowly, the salt a welcome shock to her system. They sat with their backs against the trunk of the tree, a comfortable distance between them, and watched the sun begin to set. The silence was different now. It was not the empty silence of the open desert, but a shared quiet, filled with the unspoken experiences of the day. "You never asked my name," Clara said softly, breaking the stillness. He did not look at her. "Did not seem polite to ask," he replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Figured you would tell me if you wanted me to know." "It is Clara." He nodded. "Eli." The exchange of names felt strangely intimate, a formal recognition of the bond that had been forged between them in the crucible of the desert. The simple act of naming themselves seemed to give her the courage to say more. "The town I left, it was called Hollow Creek," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I worked in the saloon. I sang." She paused, remembering the feel of the dusty stage beneath her feet, the smell of stale beer and cheap perfume. "It was not a good life, but it was mine." Eli remained silent, his stillness an invitation for her to continue. "There was a man," she said, her voice tightening. "Silas Croft. He owned the biggest ranch in the territory. He was a powerful man, and he believed that everything in that valley belonged to him, including the people." She picked at a loose thread on her dress, her eyes downcast. "He decided he wanted me. He would come into the saloon and watch me. He offered me gifts, a new dress, jewelry. He said he would set me up in a little house of my own. He thought he could buy me." A shiver ran through her, despite the warmth of the evening air. I told him no. I told him I was not for sale. His pride was wounded. A man like that cannot stand to be told no, especially not by a woman who sings for her supper in a saloon. So he decided to destroy me instead. He started a rumor that I had stolen a gold locket from him. Then the story changed. He told people I was entertaining men in my room after the saloon closed. He called me a thief and a whore. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful. She wiped them away angrily. The town! They were happy to believe him. It was easier than standing up to a man like Silas Croft. The women who had once smiled at me in the street began to cross to the other side when they saw me coming. The men who had once tipped their hats began to look at me with a different kind of expression in their eyes. The whispers followed me everywhere. I was marked. I was wicked. One night, some of his ranch hands cornered me behind the saloon. They said, "Mister." Croft had sent them to collect what was his. Her voice broke. I ran. I took my horse and I ran. And I did not look back. She finally finished, her story laid bare between them in the fading light. She braced herself for his judgment, for the flicker of disgust in his eyes, for the cold withdrawal. She had seen it 100 times. But when she dared to look at him, his expression was unchanged. There was no judgment there. There was only a deep, profound weariness, a sadness that seemed to rise from the very depths of his soul. He was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low and flat. "During the war," he said, "I killed a man who did not deserve it. He did not look at her, but stared out at the darkening plains, as if seeing a scene from a decade ago. We were on patrol. We came upon a Confederate boy. Could not have been more than 16. He was alone, his rifle on the ground. He put his hands up to surrender. He was crying. My sergeant gave the order, "No prisoners." The others hesitated. I did not. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet. I shot him. He just fell. I have seen his face every night for 10 years. He fell silent. The confession was stark, unadorned, offered not as an excuse or a comparison, but as a simple, terrible truth. He had taken her story, with all its pain and humiliation, and laid his own broken piece of soul right alongside it. In that moment, Clara understood that this silent, stoic man was just as haunted as she was. They were both running from ghosts, his of commission, hers of condemnation. His quiet guilt was a mirror to her own shame, and in that shared darkness, she felt a profound and unexpected sense of connection. They were two outcasts, adrift in a land that had no mercy for the weak or the wounded. That night, she woke from a nightmare. A silent scream caught in her throat. She was back in the alley behind the saloon, the leering faces of Silas Croft's men closing in on her. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. The desert night cold and terrifying. A shadow moved by the fire, and Eli was there. He walked over and, without a word, took the heavy woolen coat from his own shoulders and draped it around hers. It was warm from his body and smelled of smoke and the open range. He adjusted it gently, then turned and walked back to his spot by the fire, settling down as if nothing had happened. He pretended it was a simple, practical gesture against the cold, a gesture that meant nothing, but Clara knew better. She pulled the coat tighter around her, a shield against the ghosts of the past and the cold of the night. She knew he was watching over her. 2 days later, they saw it on the horizon, a small, dilapidated building that seemed to rise out of the dust itself. A trading post. Hope, a feeling she had long since forgotten, flickered within her. It meant fresh water, real food, perhaps a new pair of shoes. The post was run by a stooped, weasel-faced man with shifty eyes and a sour disposition. He looked them over with suspicion as they entered the dim, dusty interior. "Water, flour, and coffee," Eli said, his voice flat as he placed a few coins on the rough wooden counter. The owner's eyes darted from Eli's worn gear to Clara, who lingered by the door. He squinted, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He had seen a flyer, a notice from a rancher in Hollow Creek, offering a reward for information about a runaway saloon girl, a thief. "I know you," the man said, his voice a nasty whine as he pointed a grimy finger at Clara. "You are that woman from Hollow Creek, the one who stole from Mr. Croft. I want no trouble here. Get out." Clara flinched as if struck. The same words, the same accusation, even here, hundreds of miles from that wretched town. The world was a smaller, crueler place than she had ever imagined. She felt the familiar urge to run, to disappear. But Eli did not move. He slowly turned his head to look at the trading post owner. The air in the small room grew thick and cold. Eli's posture did not change, but he seemed to grow larger, harder. The quiet cowboy disappeared, replaced by something far more dangerous. "You will give us the supplies we asked for," Eli said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried a menace that was more terrifying than any shout. "And then you will go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. You did not see us. We were never here. Do you understand me?" The owner sputtered, his bravado failing him. "Now, see here." Eli took one step toward the counter. He did not raise his hand to his gun, but the owner's eyes darted to it anyway. The hardness in Eli's gaze was absolute. It was the look of a man who had crossed lines the trader could not even imagine. A man who would not hesitate to cross them again. The owner's face paled. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his skinny throat. "Yes," he squeaked, his hands trembling as he hurriedly filled a sack with flour and coffee. "Yes, I understand." Eli paid him, took the sack, and walked toward the door. He stopped beside Clara, who had been watching the entire exchange, frozen in place. "Let us go," he said, his voice once again calm and low. She followed him out into the blinding sunlight, her heart still pounding. She had never seen anything like it. She had seen men fight with fists and guns, loud and messy affairs. But this was different. This was a cold, quiet control, a promise of violence held perfectly in check. It was frightening. But as she looked at Eli's back, walking steadily away from the source of her humiliation, she felt a surge of trembling admiration. He had not fought for her honor. He had simply refused to allow it to be questioned. He had stood between her and the world. That night, they camped far from the road, in a shallow canyon that hid their fire from view. The confrontation at the trading post hung in the air between them, an unspoken thing. As she sat watching the flames, Clara knew she had to say something. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and shaky. Eli looked up from the knife he was cleaning. His eyes met hers across the fire. "For what you did," she clarified. "Back there, no one has ever—" She trailed off, unable to find the words. He just nodded, accepting her thanks without comment, but he did not look away. They sat there for a long time, the silence stretching out, no longer empty but charged with a new, potent awareness. The distance between them seemed to shrink, the small circle of firelight becoming their entire world. It was a closeness born of desperation and shared wounds, a fragile connection that neither of them dared to name, for fear that a single word might break it. In the vast, lonely dark of the desert, they were no longer just two strangers. They were two survivors, bound by a quiet, desperate gravity that was pulling them inexorably together. The air grew heavy first. It was a change Eli felt in his bones before he saw it in the sky. A sudden, oppressive stillness that smothered the desert's usual hum. The heat, which had been a dry, baking force, turned thick and humid, clinging to the skin like a wet blanket. He pulled Buster to a halt, his eyes scanning the southwestern horizon. A low, bruised purple line was expanding there, devouring the pale blue of the sky. It was not the color of a rainstorm, but something dirtier, more ominous. Clara, riding silently behind him, felt the shift as well. The horse beneath her grew skittish, its ears twitching, its nostrils flaring as it tasted the strange, metallic scent on the wind. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Trouble," Eli answered, his voice grim. He swung up into his saddle, his movements economical and urgent. "A squall line, sand, and plenty of it. We need to find cover, now." There was no cover to be found. The landscape was a vast, open platter of rock and sand, offering nothing but a few anemic creosote bushes that would be torn from the ground by the first serious gust of wind. The purple line on the horizon swelled with astonishing speed, a monstrous wave of dust and fury rolling across the plains. The sun was snuffed out, and the world was plunged into a strange, yellow-gray twilight. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that quickly rose to a high-pitched shriek. It drove needles of sand into their exposed skin, forcing them to turn their faces away. Eli spurred his horse forward, his eyes desperately searching the terrain. He was not looking for a cave or an overhang. He was looking for any anomaly, any feature that broke the monotonous flatness of the land. Then he saw it, a dark shape, half concealed by a sloping dune, something that was not rock or bush. It was the faint, straight line of a roof, nearly swallowed by the shifting sands. An old cabin, likely left by some hopeful prospector who had long since surrendered to the desert. "There!" he yelled, pointing. "Ride!" They raced toward it, the storm at their heels. The wind was a physical force now, pushing against them, trying to tear the reins from their hands. The air was thick with grit, making each breath a painful, choking effort. They reached the cabin just as the first true wall of the storm hit. It was a tiny, ramshackle structure, its wood weathered to a silver gray, its windows long since shattered. The dune had piled up against one side, burying it almost to the eaves. The door hung crookedly on one hinge. Eli leaped from his saddle, dragging the door open with a screech of protesting wood. He pulled Buster and the mules into the relative shelter of the cabin's lee side, then turned to help Clara. He practically lifted her from the saddle and pushed her through the doorway into the dark interior. He followed her in, pulling the heavy door shut against the screaming wind just as the world outside disappeared into a roaring vortex of sand. For a long moment, they stood in the darkness, their breath coming in ragged gasps, the roar of the storm a deafening presence all around them. The cabin was tiny, no more than 10 feet square. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust, dry rot, and the faint, bitter scent of pack rats. Sand poured in through the cracks in the walls and the empty window frames, a constant, whispering invasion. The wind howled like a legion of damned souls, and the fine grit scoured the wooden walls with a sound like 1,000 tiny claws. The world had been reduced to this small, dark, suffocating space. Eli fumbled in his saddlebag, his hands finding a precious cache of matches and a nub of a candle. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light a small miracle in the gloom. The cabin was as bare and desolate as he had expected. A broken cot lay in one corner, and a crude stone fireplace was built into the back wall. In the flickering candlelight, the space felt impossibly small. It was too small for one person, let alone two. And it was far too small for the unspoken things that had been growing between them. The shared guilt, the simmering awareness, the desperate, unnamed desire. Just as the sandstorm reached its peak fury, the sky opened up. A sudden, violent downpour began, the rain driving down in thick, muddy sheets. It was not a cleansing rain, but a deluge of filth, turning the airborne dust into a thick, gritty paste. Water found its way through the roof, dripping down in a dozen places, hissing where it hit the floor. Clara's dress, already thin and worn, was soaked through in an instant. The wet fabric clung to her, the grit embedded in it chafing her skin. She began to shiver, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook her entire body. Eli, who had been trying to block the worst of the leaks with his canvas tarp, turned and saw her. She was huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped around herself, her teeth chattering. For the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain, almost flustered. His usual stoicism was replaced by a raw, awkward concern. He stripped the bedroll from his shoulder and unrolled it, pulling out his spare woolen blanket. It was his only dry possession. "Here," he said, his voice gruff, as if he were angry at the situation, at her shivering, at his own unfamiliar feelings. He held the blanket out to her. She looked at him, her eyes wide in the candlelight. She hesitated, not wanting to take the last of his comfort, but the shivering was too intense. She nodded, and her cold fingers brushed against his as she took the heavy blanket from him. The brief touch was like a spark, a sudden jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the wool. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, the scent of him, clean and masculine, enveloping her. It was a gesture of such profound and simple care that it brought a lump to her throat. They settled into a tense silence. The storm, their only conversation. He managed to start a small, smoky fire in the hearth with some of the rotted wood from the cot. The meager flames pushed back the darkness and the worst of the cold, but they also shrank the room further, drawing them into an intimate circle of light. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the few feet between them feeling like both a vast canyon and no distance at all. Clara watched him, the firelight carving his face into planes of light and shadow, highlighting the hard line of his jaw and the deep-set weariness in his eyes. He was a man who kept the world at arm's length, and yet he had let her in. The storm raged on, a wild, untamed thing. A sudden, brilliant flash of lightning lit the cabin, bleaching the world white for a split second. In that stark, unforgiving light, their eyes met across the fire, and Eli saw it. He saw the change in her, the fear that had lived in her eyes since he had found her. The haunted, hunted look of a cornered animal was gone. In its place was something else, something clear and direct. It was a look of profound, unflinching acceptance. She was not looking at a savior or a protector. She was looking at him, at Eli, the man with his own ghosts. And she was not afraid. In that single, silent glance, she gave him permission to be seen. The look broke something open in the quiet between them. It made the silence that followed feel different, less about what was unsaid, and more about what was waiting to be spoken. "What did you want to be, Eli?" Clara asked, her voice soft, barely audible over the howl of the wind. "Before the war, before everything." The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him a question like that in more than a decade. People asked him where he was heading, or what he was hauling, or if he was fast with his gun. No one asked what he had wanted to be. The dream was so old, so buried beneath layers of blood and dust and regret, that it took him a moment to find it. He stared into the fire, his voice low when he finally spoke. "Land," he said. "That is all I ever wanted. A piece of land that was mine. Not a big ranch, nothing grand, just a small plot in a green valley somewhere. A place where you could put a seed in the ground and watch it grow. I wanted to build a house with my own hands, a porch to sit on in the evenings. I wanted—" He hesitated, the next words tasting like rust in his mouth. "I wanted a family, a wife, children, the sound of their laughter, you know?" He fell silent, a profound and aching sorrow in his eyes. He had confessed to her his greatest sin. Now he had confessed his greatest loss, the dream of a simple, decent life, a life he felt he had forfeited forever on that damp forest floor in Tennessee. Clara listened, her heart aching for him, for the gentle soul buried beneath the calloused exterior. She saw the house with the porch. She saw the fields of corn. She heard the laughter of the children who would never be born. He looked up at her, his gaze intense. "What about you, Clara? What was your dream before you had to sing in that saloon?" A sad smile touched her lips. "It is foolish. Tell me," he insisted, his voice soft. She took a deep breath. "I wanted to sing in a church choir," she admitted, the words feeling strange and foreign on her tongue. When I was a little girl, my mother would take me to church on Sundays. The light would come through the stained glass windows, all colors, like jewels, and the choir would sing. Their voices would fill up the whole building, rising up to the rafters. It sounded so clean, so pure. I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to make a sound that beautiful. She looked down at her hands, at the dirt beneath her nails, at the calluses forming on her palms. A saloon singer, a fallen woman. The distance between what she had wanted and what she had become was a chasm too wide to cross. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another followed. She began to cry, not with the loud, heaving sobs, but with a silent, desperate grief for the lost innocence of both their dreams. Eli watched her, his heart twisting in his chest. He was a man of action, not of comfort. He did not know the soft words or gentle gestures to soothe a woman's tears. He only knew what his instincts told him to do. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused, engulfing her smaller, softer one. He did not pull her closer, did not stroke her skin. He just held it, a solid, unwavering anchor in the storm. He was not sure if it was a gesture of comfort or a desperate act of restraint, a way to keep himself from doing more. At that moment, a deafening crack of thunder shook the small cabin to its foundations. The sound was a physical blow, vibrating through the floorboards, rattling the very air they breathed. Clara gasped, a small, involuntary cry of shock. The sound, the touch of his hand, the raw emotion of the moment. It was all too much. The tension that had been stretched taut between them for days finally snapped. She leaned forward, trembling, closing the small gap between them. He met her halfway. Their kiss was not soft or tender. It was a collision of two lonely, desperate souls. It was born of exhaustion and fear and a need so profound it had been starved for years. It tasted of dust and rain and the salt of her tears. His lips were firm, chapped, and he kissed her with a raw, desperate hunger that she met with her own. His other hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her damp, gritty hair. She clung to him, her hands gripping his shirt, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was trying to tear itself apart. It was a kiss that did not ask for promises or a future. It was a kiss that demanded only this single, searing moment of connection, a defiant spark of life against the howling darkness. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, the air in the cabin thick and heavy. The storm still raged outside, but its fury seemed distant now, muted by the roaring in their own blood. They stared at each other in the flickering firelight, their faces close. What had just passed between them a wild and undeniable truth. Clara reached up and gently touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the rough line of his jaw. Her eyes were dark, luminous, filled with a depth of emotion that stole his breath. She whispered the words, her voice a ragged, trembling thread of sound. But this time, they were not the words of a delirious, dying woman in the desert. They were a confession, a prayer, an answer to a question she had not even known she was asking. "I've been waiting so long." The dawn broke over a world scoured and remade. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible clarity and a landscape washed clean. The sun rose, casting long, sharp shadows, and the air was cool and crisp. Inside the cabin, a profound quiet had fallen. Eli added the last piece of wood to the fire, the small flames of fragile warmth in the morning chill. He and Clara moved around the small space, gathering their things, their movements slow and deliberate. They did not speak of the night before. They did not need to. A line had been crossed, a seal had been broken. Something fundamental had shifted between them. As surely as the storm had shifted the dunes outside, they were not healed. Their ghosts had not been banished. Their wounds were still raw and deep, but they were no longer two separate, solitary souls adrift in the wilderness. They were bound, tied together by a desperate kiss in a dark cabin. Their fates now intertwined, for better or for worse. The desert stretched before them, vast and uncertain, but they would not face it alone. The world after the storm was sharp and clean. The air, scrubbed of dust, was so clear that the distant mountains seemed close enough to touch. A new quiet settled over their journey. But it was not the empty silence of before. It was a space filled with the memory of the cabin, of a desperate kiss and whispered confessions. They did not speak of it. To put words to what had happened between them felt like it would be a profanation, like trying to capture a fragile, wild thing and put it in a cage. But it was there, in the way he would look back to check on her, his gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary. It was there in the way she watched his hands as he adjusted a mule's pack, remembering the feel of them on her skin. They were moving toward a town called Dry Springs, a name on Eli's map that promised little more than a well and a handful of buildings. For Eli, it represented a chance for work, a way to earn enough to get them further west, further away from the long shadow of Silas Croft. For Clara, it represented a place to vanish. She had no dreams left of a new life, only a desperate yearning for anonymity, to become a woman with no past, a ghost that the world would pass by without a second glance. The intimacy forged in the storm had not given her hope for a future, but it had given her something to hold on to in the present. The man walking beside her horse was no longer just a protector. He was a fellow traveler in the wilderness of their pasts. They had been traveling for 2 days in this new, fragile peace when Eli saw the dust. It was a faint plume on the northern horizon, a telltale sign of riders moving fast. He did not say anything at first, but Clara saw the change in him. His body grew tense, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the terrain, his hand dropping to rest almost unconsciously on the butt of his revolver. The easy, rhythmic stride he had maintained for miles became tighter, more watchful. "What is it?" she asked, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. "Riders," he said, his voice low and flat. "5 of them, coming this way." There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The land was flat and open, a vast, exposed stage. To turn and flee would be an admission of guilt, an invitation to a chase they could not win. Eli's mind worked with a cold, swift clarity. He pulled Buster to a halt and turned to face her, his eyes locking with hers. "Clara," he said, his voice urgent and quiet. "Listen to me. Keep your head down. Pull that blanket up around your shoulders. You are my sister. You have a fever, and I am taking you to the doctor in Dry Springs. Do not look at them. Do not speak, no matter what they say. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight to form words. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She pulled the woolen blanket he had given her in the cabin up around her head, creating a cowl that shadowed her face. She slumped in the saddle, trying to make herself look small and sick. Eli took the reins and began walking again, his pace slow and steady, the picture of a weary traveler with no reason to hurry and nothing to hide. The riders grew from distant specks into fully formed men. They were hard-faced and heavily armed, their clothes coated in the same dust that covered everything else in this land. They rode with the easy arrogance of men who knew they were the predators here. Their leader, a big man with a thick dark beard and cold, porcine eyes, reined in his horse, blocking their path. The other 4 fanned out, surrounding them in a loose, intimidating circle. "That is far enough, friend," the bearded man said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed unpleasantly close to Eli's boot. Eli stopped, looking up at the man with a weary patience. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, his tone level, betraying no fear. "We are looking for someone," the rider said, his eyes flicking from Eli to the huddled shape of Clara on the horse, then back again. "A woman, running from a town called Hollow Creek. You seen anyone like that on the trail?" "Cannot say that I have," Eli replied, shaking his head. Just been me and my sister here for the past week. She took a fever back on the Cimarron, trying to get her to a doctor before it gets worse. He gestured vaguely toward Clara. We have not seen another soul. The leader's eyes narrowed with suspicion. He scrutinized Eli's worn clothes, his pack mules, his calm demeanor. He seemed to be weighing the truth of the story. Clara kept her face hidden in the shadows of the blanket, her body trembling. She could feel their eyes on her, feel the weight of their suspicion. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, on Eli's calm, steady presence before her. "What is your name?" the man demanded. "Harris," Eli lied smoothly, the name coming to him from the deepest, most guarded part of his memory. "John Harris." The name meant nothing to the rider. He seemed about to accept the story, to wave them on his way. But then one of the other men, a lanky rider with a pock-marked face, spurred his horse forward. "Hold on, boss," he said, squinting at Clara. "Let me get a look at her. There is something familiar." A cold dread washed over Clara. She recognized the man's voice. He was one of them. One of the men from the alley behind the saloon. Eli stepped instinctively, positioning himself between the rider and Clara. "My sister is sick," he said, his voice losing its weary edge and taking on a cold, hard tone. "She needs to rest, not be gawked at by the likes of you." "Let me see her face," the pockmarked man insisted, his hand moving toward his gun. "She looks like the girl we are after, the one from the saloon." The bearded leader's eyes lit up with renewed interest. "Is that so? Well then, Mr. Harris, why do you not just ask your sister to lower that blanket so we can all be on our way?" It was over. The lie had failed. In the split second of silence that followed, Eli knew there was only one path left. His movements were a blur of pure, violent instinct. He shoved the leader's horse hard, sending the animal stumbling sideways. At the same instant, he lunged for Buster's reins, yanking the horse's head around. "Hold on!" he roared at Clara. He leaped into the saddle behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist as he kicked the horse into a desperate gallop. The riders shouted in surprise and anger. The first gunshot cracked the air, the bullet whining past Clara's ear. The world dissolved into a chaotic symphony of thundering hooves, panicked shouts, and the sharp, terrifying report of gunfire. Eli drove Buster relentlessly, not across the open plain, but toward a series of jagged rock formations and winding arroyos that offered the only chance of escape. They plunged into a dry creek bed, the horse's hooves slipping on the loose gravel. The canyon walls rose up around them, echoing the sound of the chase. Bullets chipped stone from the rocks beside them, showering them with deadly splinters. Clara clung to the saddle horn, her face pressed into the horse's mane, her body held securely by Eli's strong arms. She was terrified, but a part of her was strangely calm. She was not alone. For the first time in her flight, she was not alone. Eli was magnificent. He rode not like a man, but like an extension of the horse itself, guiding it through the treacherous, twisting landscape with a skill that was born of 100 desperate situations. He knew the land, knew how to use its dips and turns to their advantage. They burst out of one canyon and into another, the sounds of their pursuers growing fainter for a moment, then louder again as the riders found their trail. The chase went on for what felt like an eternity, a desperate, lung-searing race against death. Their horses were lathered in sweat, their sides heaving, but Eli pushed them on, demanding every last ounce of their strength. They were rounding a sharp bend in a narrow wash when he felt it. It was not a sharp, searing pain, but a sudden, violent impact, a brutal punch to his left side that stole his breath and made the world flash white for a second. He grunted, the sound a mix of pain and surprise. A stray bullet, a lucky shot from one of the riders, had found its mark. He ignored the sudden, hot wetness spreading across his shirt. He could not stop, not yet. He pushed the horse for another mile, then another, until the sounds of the chase had finally faded behind them. swallowed by the maze of canyons. Only when he was certain they were safe, hidden deep within a tangled network of ravines, did he allow himself to stop. He slid from the saddle, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. He leaned against the horse for a moment, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. "Eli?" Clara asked, her voice trembling as she scrambled down from the horse. "Are you hurt?" He tried to straighten up, to wave away her concern, but a wave of dizziness washed over him. He stumbled, and she saw it then, the dark, ugly stain spreading across the side of his shirt, turning the faded blue fabric to a deep, wet crimson. "Oh, God," she whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. He sank to his knees, his face pale and beaded with sweat. The strength that had seemed so boundless was draining out of him, leaving him looking vulnerable and terribly human. Clara was at his side in an instant, her panic giving way to a fierce, protective urgency. She had to stop the bleeding. Without a second thought, she grabbed the hem of her own worn dress, the only clean cloth she had, and ripped a long, wide strip from it. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were steady as she pressed the makeshift bandage against the wound on his side. He hissed in pain as she tied it tightly around his waist. He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with pain. "Clara," he murmured, his voice weak. "You have to go. Leave me. They will find us if you stay. Take the horse. Ride south." His words were a physical blow, more painful than any bullet. He was trying to save her. Even now, he was trying to push her away, back into the solitary wilderness. The frightened girl who had stumbled out of the desert would have listened. She would have run. But that girl was gone, burned away by the sun and remade in a storm-tossed cabin. "No," she said, her voice fierce, absolute. She knelt before him, her hands framing his face, forcing him to look at her. "I am not leaving you. Do you hear me? I am not running again." Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of fear. They were tears of defiance. She would not let this man, the only person who had ever seen her, truly seen her, die alone in this God-forsaken place. She pressed her forehead against his, a silent vow passing between them. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she got him to his feet, leaning heavily on her. He staggered forward, his steps slow and agonizing. She scanned the canyon walls, her eyes searching for any sign of shelter. She found it 50 yards away, a dark opening in the rock face, a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of sun-bleached brush. It was not much, but it was a refuge. It took all of her strength, but she got him there, half dragging, half carrying him into the cool darkness of the cave. He collapsed onto the sandy floor, his body already succumbing to the shock and blood loss. He was slipping away from her. The days that followed blurred into a waking nightmare. Eli's wound was angry and inflamed, and a fever took hold of him, plunging him into a delirious world of shadows and ghosts. Clara became his guardian, his nurse, his anchor to the living world. She left the cave only when she had to, creeping out to a small, muddy seep she had found to fill their canteen, her ears straining for any sound of approaching riders. She kept the bandage on his wound as clean as she could, tearing more strips from her dwindling dress. She bathed his face and body with cool water, trying to fight the raging fire within him. She whispered to him, telling him stories, memories of her childhood, anything to keep the sound of a human voice in the suffocating silence of the cave. And in his delirium, he spoke. He did not speak to her, but to the phantoms that haunted his fevered mind. He was back in the war, the smell of gunpowder thick in his nostrils. He cried out orders, murmured the names of men long dead. He argued with a stern-faced sergeant, his voice pleading, "He is just a boy." He would cry, his hands clenching at the empty air. He surrendered. Then the vision would shift, and he would see other faces. The faces of men he had faced down in dusty streets and dark saloons in the years after the war. Each name was a confession, a weight on his soul that the fever was now dragging into the light. Through it all, he would whisper a single, desperate plea to the shadows. "Forgive me," he would murmur, his voice thick with a decade of unshed tears. "Please forgive me, if—" Clara listened to it all. She sat beside him through the long, terrifying nights, holding his hand, her own tears falling silently onto his hot skin. And as she listened to the raw, unfiltered agony of his soul, a profound and unshakable truth settled in her heart. She loved this man. She loved him not for his strength or his ability to protect her. She loved him for his weakness, for his wounds, for the broken pieces of his past that so perfectly mirrored her own. He was not a hero who had saved her from her haunted mind. He was a fellow ghost, and in his pain, she finally understood the depths of her own. She was not a victim he had rescued. They were two halves of the same broken whole. Outside the cave, the world remained a harsh and unforgiving place. Buzzards, the patient undertakers of the desert, began to circle high overhead, black specks against the merciless blue sky. They had scented the blood, the fever, the slow, creeping approach of death. They were waiting. The whole world seemed to be waiting for them to succumb, to be devoured, to become just another pair of bleached bones in the sand. But inside the cave, life clung on with a fierce and stubborn tenacity. Clara held Eli's hand, her small form a defiant shield against the vast, waiting emptiness. She would not let the world have him. She would not let his ghosts claim him. She clung to him, and he, in his unconsciousness, clung to her, his fingers tightening around hers in a moment of feverish nightmare. Together, in the cool, dark earth, they were a single, small point of resistance, a shared breath, a shared heartbeat, defying the death that circled so patiently outside. The fever broke like a storm in the dead of night. One moment, Eli was a vessel of heat, his body a battlefield of ghosts. The next, a great shudder ran through him, and a sheen of sweat, cool and cleansing, broke out across his skin. He fell into a deep, natural sleep for the first time in days. Clara, who had been dozing fitfully by his side, woke at the change and felt his forehead. It was cool. The fire was out. Tears of sheer, bone-deep exhaustion and relief streamed down her face in the darkness of the cave. She had won. She had held back the darkness and pulled him back into the world of the living. When he finally opened his eyes, the morning sun was a pale gold sliver at the mouth of the cave. His gaze was clear, lucid, and it found her immediately. He saw her, truly saw her, and in that single look, he understood everything. He saw the new, fierce strength in her eyes, the dark circles of exhaustion beneath them, the tattered remains of her dress that she had used to save his life. He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert, and only a dry rasp emerged. She was there in an instant, lifting his head gently, bringing the canteen to his lips. The water was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a ghost of its former self. The name was a prayer, an apology, an acknowledgement of a debt he could never repay. "Rest, Eli," she said softly, her hand stroking his hair back from his forehead. "Just rest." His recovery was slow, a painstaking climb back from the brink. He was humbled by his own weakness, by his complete dependence on her. The stoic walls he had built around himself had been turned to rubble, and in their place was a raw, open vulnerability. He watched her as she moved about the cave, her actions efficient and sure, and he was filled with a quiet awe. This was the woman he had found half dead in the sand, and she had become a fierce and capable survivor who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. The roles had been reversed, and in that reversal, they found a new and deeper equilibrium. They were no longer a protector and his ward. They were partners, bound by blood and fever and a love that had been forged in the darkest of places. When he was strong enough to ride, they left the canyon behind. Their destination was a place he had heard spoken of in whispers, a small, isolated town called Dry Hollow. It was known as a refuge, a place at the end of the world where people went when they had no other place to go. A town that did not ask questions because its inhabitants all had answers they did not wish to give. It was a town for lost souls. It was a town for them. The journey was different this time. They rode slowly, carefully, with Eli in the saddle and Clara walking beside him, her hand often resting on his knee, as if to reassure herself that he was truly there, solid and alive. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer heavy with unspoken things. It was a comfortable, easy quiet, the silence of two people who understood each other without the need for words. Dry Hollow was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen weathered buildings, nestled in a small valley that seemed to have been overlooked by the rest of the world. It was quiet, sleepy, and blessedly anonymous. On the outskirts of the town, they came upon a small, well-kept ranch. A neat, whitewashed house stood beside a sturdy barn, surrounded by a vegetable garden and a few chickens scratching in the dirt. An old woman with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple and eyes as sharp and clear as a blue winter sky was splitting firewood with a practiced, steady rhythm. She looked up as they approached, her gaze taking in their ragged appearance, the makeshift bandage still visible beneath Eli's shirt, and the profound weariness that clung to them both. She leaned the axe against the chopping block and wiped her hands on her apron. "You look like you have come a long way on a hard road," she said, her voice raspy but kind. "We have, ma'am," Eli replied, his voice still weak. "We are looking for work, a place to stay for a spell." The woman studied them for a long moment, her shrewd eyes seeming to see right through them, past the dirt and the exhaustion, to the wounded souls beneath. She had seen countless drifters pass through Dry Hollow over the years. She knew the look of people on the run. "My name is Martha," she said finally. "My husband passed on 2 years ago, and the fences are in constant need of mending. The work is hard, and the pay is only a roof over your head and food in your belly. The bunkhouse out back is small, but it is dry." "That would be more than enough, ma'am," Clara said, her voice filled with a gratitude so immense it was almost painful. "We would be grateful." Martha nodded. "I ask only 2 things, no trouble, and an honest day's work." "You will have both," Eli promised. And so, for a few fleeting, golden weeks, they found peace. The small bunkhouse, with its simple cot and clean-swept floor, became their sanctuary. The ranch became their world. Life slowed down to the rhythm of the sun and the seasons. Clara, who had only known the frantic, artificial world of the saloon, discovered a deep and profound satisfaction in the simple, honest work of the ranch. She helped Martha in the garden, her hands learning the feel of the soil. She collected eggs from the chickens, baked bread in the warm kitchen, and mended clothes by the fire in the evenings. The work was grounding, real. It washed away the grime of Hollow Creek, replacing the ghost of the saloon singer with a strong, capable woman who knew the joy of a perfect loaf of bread or a row of freshly weeded carrots. Eli, meanwhile, began the slow work of mending fences. The physical labor was a balm to his soul. As his body healed, so too did some part of his spirit. The simple, repetitive act of stretching wire, of digging post holes, of making something broken whole again, was a powerful form of penance. He was literally building a boundary, a defense, around the fragile peace they had found. He was learning to live quietly again, after years of looking over his shoulder, of sleeping with one hand on his gun. The profound quiet of the valley was a strange and welcome gift. He would watch Clara as she moved about the yard, her face relaxed, a genuine smile touching her lips, and he would be filled with a love so fierce and tender that it almost frightened him. He had never allowed himself to feel anything so deeply. He had never believed he deserved it. In the cool of the evenings, after the chores were done, they would sit on the porch of Martha's small house, the 3 of them, and watch the stars appear in the vast, dark sky. Martha would tell them stories of her life, of crossing the plains in a wagon train, of building this ranch with her husband from nothing, and when she would go inside, Eli and Clara would stay, sitting close together on the steps, their shoulders brushing. It was in these quiet moments that they allowed themselves to dream. "I was thinking," Eli said one night, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "There is a creek on the other side of this valley, good water, a stand of cottonwoods." Clara knew what he was saying. It was the beginning of a game they played, a game of pretend. "Is there good land?" she asked softly. "The best," he replied, a smile in his voice. "You could grow anything there. Corn, beans, a garden bigger than Martha's." "We would need a house," she said, playing along, her heart aching with the sweetness of the fantasy. "A small cabin first," he planned. "Just one room, but with a big stone fireplace and a porch, a wide porch for sitting on in the evenings." "I would like that," she whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder. "A cabin with a wide porch." They would talk like this for hours, building a life for themselves out of words and wishes, a fragile fortress against the harsh reality of their world. They were pretending, and they both knew it. They were pretending the past could not find them, that men like Silas Croft did not exist, that the world might, for once, show them mercy and let them be. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking lie, and for a few short weeks, they allowed themselves to believe it. But the world does not forget, and word, like water, always finds a way to travel, even to a forgotten place like Dry Hollow. The lone rider who had fled the canyon had made his way back to Hollow Creek. He had told his story, and the long arm of Silas Croft, fueled by vengeance and wounded pride, had reached out once more. The end of their peace came on a bright, cloudless afternoon. The air was warm, filled with the scent of hay and Martha's baking. Clara was humming to herself as she carried a bucket of water from the well. Eli was in the corral, brushing down his horse. Martha was in the kitchen. It was a perfect, ordinary moment, and then the riders appeared. There were 4 of them this time, cresting the small hill that overlooked the ranch. They were not moving fast. They rode with a slow, deliberate menace, their message clear. There was no escape. Eli saw them first. His body went rigid, the brush falling from his hand. The quiet man who mended fences vanished in an instant, replaced by the hardened survivor who had fought his way through a war and 100 lonely dangers since. "Clara," he said, his voice low and deadly calm. "Get Martha. Go inside the house. Bar the door. Do not come out." She saw the riders then, and the blood drained from her face. She did not argue. She dropped the bucket and ran to the house, her heart pounding with a familiar, sickening dread. Eli walked slowly out to the center of the yard, his hands empty. Away from his sides, he stood there, waiting, a lone figure against the backdrop of the peaceful ranch. The riders pulled up a few yards from him. The man in the lead was the big, bearded man from before. Beside him was the pockmarked rider whose recognition had started the chase. Well, the bearded man sneered. "Look what we found. John Harris, is it? Or should I say, Eli Carson? Took us a while, but we are very persistent men." "This is my home," Eli said, his voice as cold and hard as stone. "You are not welcome here. Turn around and ride out." The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This is not your home, and we are not leaving without the girl. Mr. Croft wants his property back. He is also offering a handsome reward for the man who shot up his best riders." "She is not property," Eli said, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "And I am not going anywhere. I am telling you for the last time, leave." "Brave words for a dead man," the leader said, and his hand moved toward his gun. The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. Eli had anticipated the move, his own hand a blur as he drew his Colt. He fired twice, the shots so close together they sounded like one. The pockmarked rider and the man next to him were thrown from their saddles before they could even clear their holsters. But there were two more. The leader and the fourth man fired back, the air filled with the whine of bullets and the smell of cordite. Eli dove behind a water trough, a splinter of wood flying past his face. He came up firing, but a searing, white-hot pain tore through his left shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him to the ground. Inside the house, Clara screamed as she saw him fall. All of Eli's warnings, all of her fear, were burned away by a single, blinding thought. They were going to kill him. She burst out of the door, her mind empty of everything but the need to get to him. The two remaining riders were advancing, their guns drawn, their faces grim with murderous intent. Clara ran, heedless of the danger, and reached Eli's side. He was conscious, trying to push himself up, his face a mask of pain. "The barn," he gasped. "Get me to the barn." She hooked her arms under his, dragging him, his boots scraping in the dirt. A bullet kicked up dust at her feet. She did not stop. She pulled him with the last of her strength through the wide barn doors and let him slump to the hay-strewn floor. The bearded leader followed them, his shadow falling across the doorway. He raised his pistol, a cruel smile on his face. "Nowhere left to run," he said. Clara's eyes darted around the dim interior of the barn. She saw Eli's revolver lying in the dirt where it had fallen from his hand. Without thinking, without allowing fear or reason to stop her, she lunged for it. The gun was heavy, alien in her hand. She raised it, both hands trembling, and pointed it at the man in the doorway. He laughed at the sight of her. It was the last sound he ever made. She pulled the trigger. The roar of the shot was deafening in the enclosed space, the recoil slamming her back against the wall. The man's eyes went wide with shock, a dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. He staggered backward and fell, his body landing half in and half out of the barn. Silence, a profound, ringing silence. Clara stared at the gun in her hand, then at the dead man in the doorway. A wave of nausea and horror washed over her. She had taken a life. The girl who had dreamed of singing in a church choir was gone forever, replaced by a killer. A single gunshot from outside broke the spell, then a cry. Clara peered out the door. The fourth rider was on the ground, and old Martha was standing on the porch of her house, a long-barreled shotgun in her hands. But as the rider fell, he got off one last, desperate shot. Martha crumpled to the porch, the shotgun clattering beside her. The last surviving bounty rider, seeing his companions dead, scrambled onto his horse and fled, a messenger of death riding back to tell his master what had happened. Clara ran to the porch. Martha was still breathing, her eyes looking up at the sky. "You be good children," she whispered, a faint, bloody smile on her lips. Then her eyes went vacant. Clara knelt there for a long moment, the world spinning around her. The quiet sanctuary had become a graveyard. She went back into the barn, back to Eli. He was bleeding badly, his breathing shallow. She knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap, the full weight of the tragedy crashing down on her. She began to sob, great, racking sobs that shook her entire body. "It is us," she cried, her tears falling onto his pale face. "We did this. Everything we touch, everyone who helps us, it all ends in tragedy. We are poison. Eli." He reached up with his good hand, his fingers weak, and touched her cheek. His eyes were filled with a terrible, clear-eyed sadness. He looked at the bodies in the yard, at the dead woman on the porch, at the killer he had made of the woman he loved. He whispered, his voice a bare thread of sound, so quiet she had to lean in to hear him. "Maybe," he said, his breath catching in a pained gasp, "maybe love was never meant to survive in a place like this." He took a shuddering breath, his eyes locking with hers, holding her there with the last of his strength. "But we will die trying." The silence that fell upon Martha's ranch was heavier than any sound. It was a silence of death, thick with the coppery scent of blood and the profound, aching absence of a good woman's life. Clara worked with a grim, numb efficiency, her horror and grief walled off behind a dam of necessity. She cleaned and bound Eli's new wound, the bullet having torn through the fleshy part of his shoulder, a painful but not a fatal injury. Her hands, which had trembled when she first tended to him in the desert, were now steady. The woman who had taken a life in the barn was not the same woman who had dreamed of a church choir. They could not stay. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb, a testament to the tragedy that followed them. Under the cold light of the moon, they buried Martha in her own garden, among the plants she had tended with such care. Eli, his arm in a sling, his face pale and etched with pain, said the few simple words of farewell. There was no time for proper grief. With the surviving horses and what little they could carry, they left the small, peaceful valley behind and rode into the heart of Dry Hollow. They found refuge in the abandoned blacksmith shop at the edge of town, a cavernous, dark space that smelled of coal dust and rust. It was a fitting hideout, a place of iron and fire, for the final act of their story was about to be forged. The town knew they were there. The town knew what had happened at Martha's ranch. Word of the shootout had spread like a brush fire. Doors that had been open to them were now closed. Faces that had been friendly were now averted. The people of Dry Hollow were caught in the terrible vice of their own conscience, torn between a deep, human sympathy for the two fugitives and the paralyzing fear of the man who was coming for them. News of his approach arrived a day before he did, carried by a lone, terrified traveler from the east. Silas Croft was riding with a dozen men, maybe more. He was not sending bounty riders this time. He was coming himself to burn out the infection of defiance that had taken root in his territory. He was coming to reclaim what he saw as his property and to avenge the men who had died in his service. He was coming to wipe Eli and Clara from the face of the earth. The town's self-appointed mayor, a nervous, balding man named Abernathy, paid them a visit as dusk fell. He stood in the doorway of the blacksmith shop, twisting his hat in his hands, unable to meet their eyes. "You have to leave, son," he said to Eli. "He is not a reasonable man. He will tear this town apart to get to you. The folks here, they are scared. They will not help you." "I do not expect them to," Eli said, his voice quiet. He was sitting on an anvil, cleaning his Colt revolver with his one good hand, his movements slow and deliberate. "This is my fight, not theirs." "There is no fight to be had," Abernathy insisted, his voice cracking. "It is a slaughter. Take the woman and run. It is the only chance you have." "Running is what brought this here," Eli said, his voice flat and final. He looked up, and the cold intensity in his eyes made the mayor take a step back. "There is no more running. Tell your people to stay inside when the sun comes up. That is the only help I ask for." Abernathy scurried away, and the town held its breath. The last light of day bled from the sky, and a deep, starless dark settled over Dry Hollow. Inside the blacksmith shop, a single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. This was their last night on earth, and they both knew it. Eli finished with his gun and looked at Clara. She was sitting on a pile of old burlap sacks, her face pale in the lamplight, her expression one of grim resolve. He had never loved her more than he did in that moment. He saw all of her, the frightened girl from the desert, the fierce nurse from the cave, the avenging angel from the barn, and his heart ached with a love so powerful it was a physical pain. He went to her and knelt before her, taking her hands in his good one. They were cold. "Clara," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "when the moon sets, I want you to take Buster. Ride east. Do not stop until you are 100 miles from here. Find a city. Change your name. Start a new life." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a sad, unwavering light. "And you?" she asked softly. "I am going to buy you that time," he said. "That is all I have left to give. My fight tomorrow. Let it have a purpose. Let it be for you. For your freedom. Do not let it be for nothing. Please, Clara, live." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She reached out and touched the haggard lines of his face, her fingers tracing the scar by his eye. "I have been running my whole life, Eli," she whispered. "I ran from the whispers in Hollow Creek. I ran from Silas Croft. I have been running so long, I have forgotten what it feels like to stand still." She shook her head, a slow, final gesture of refusal. "I am not running anymore. My place is here, beside you. Whatever comes with the sunrise, we face it together." He tried to argue, to plead, but he saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes. It was the same resolve he felt in his own soul. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, burying his face in her hair. They did not speak again. They simply held each other through the long, dark hours. Two solitary flames burning as one against the encroaching, final darkness. The sunrise was a conflagration, a brutal explosion of crimson and orange that set the eastern sky ablaze. It spilled into the dusty main street of Dry Hollow, painting the weathered storefronts in bloody light. The town was a ghost town. Every door was barred, every window shuttered. The only sound was the low, mournful sigh of the wind. Eli stood in the shadows of the blacksmith's doorway, his wounded shoulder a throbbing agony. He had positioned Clara in the loft with a rifle he had taken from one of the dead riders and a clear line of sight down the street. She was a fair shot, he had discovered, with a calm and steady hand. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and he was half crippled, but they were together. They came as the sun cleared the horizon, a dark tide of riders appearing at the end of the street. At their head was Silas Croft. He was a big man, dressed in a fine black coat, his face florid with anger and arrogance. He sat upon his horse like a king surveying his domain, his eyes scanning the empty street for his quarry. "Carson!" he bellowed, his voice echoing in the unnatural silence. "I know you are in there. I have come for what is mine. Send out the girl, and I might let you die quickly." Eli stepped out from the shadows into the full, blazing light of the sun. He stood alone in the middle of the street, his revolver held loosely at his side. "She is not yours," he called back, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the dust. "And she never was." Croft's face contorted with rage. "Then you will die for her," he snarled, and he raised his hand. The street erupted in gunfire. Eli did not wait for the order. He fired first, his shot aimed not at Croft, but at the man to his right. The rider tumbled from his saddle. Eli was already moving, diving behind an overturned wagon as a volley of shots tore through the space where he had been standing. The air was filled with the roar of guns, the whine of ricochets, and the thunder of panicked horses. From the loft, Clara fired the rifle, the sound a sharp crack above the din. One of Croft's men cried out and fell, clutching his leg. Eli used the distraction to his advantage. He was wounded, his movements slower than they should have been, but his mind was sharp, his aim true. He fought with a cold, desperate intelligence, making every bullet count. He was not fighting to win. He was fighting to trade his life for as many of theirs as he could. He took down another man who was trying to flank him, the man's shot going wide as he fell. He was a phantom, a force of pure, defiant will. But he was only one man, and he was bleeding. He was reloading behind the wagon when he felt a searing pain in his leg. He grunted, his leg buckling beneath him. He had been hit again. He pushed himself up, leaning against the wagon for support, and saw Silas Croft dismounting, a rifle in his hands, a look of triumphant hatred on his face. Eli raised his own gun, but Croft was faster. A blinding, white-hot agony exploded in Eli's chest. The world tilted on its axis, the blazing sun spinning in a dizzying arc. He fell, the dust of the street rising up to meet him, his revolver clattering from his lifeless fingers. Clara screamed his name from the loft, a raw, animal sound of pure anguish. She saw him fall, saw Croft advancing on his body like a vulture. She did not hesitate. She scrambled down the ladder, her rifle forgotten, her mind consumed by a single, desperate purpose. She ran out into the street, into the sudden, ringing silence that had fallen, and knelt by Eli's side. He was still alive, his breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. His eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. Croft stopped a few feet away, a cruel, victorious smirk on his face. "It is over, girl," he said. "Now you will come with me." Clara did not look at him. She looked only at Eli, at the life that was rapidly fading from his eyes. Her hand fell upon the revolver lying in the dust beside him. It was still warm. She picked it up, the weight of it familiar now, an extension of her own grief and rage. Croft saw the movement and his smirk faltered, his eyes widening in surprise as he began to raise his own rifle. She was faster. She raised the gun, leveled it at the man who had destroyed her life, and fired the last shot. The bullet struck Silas Croft squarely in the chest, the force of it throwing him backward. He fell in a heap. His reign of pride and cruelty ended in the dust of a town that had not even known his name a week before. Silence. A profound, absolute silence descended upon the street. The remaining riders, their leader dead, looked at each other in confusion, then at the lone woman kneeling over the body of her lover. Without a word, they turned their horses and rode away, melting back into the desert from which they had come. The wind picked up, carrying away the lingering smoke of gunpowder, whispering through the empty street. Clara held Eli, cradling his head in her lap. The world had shrunk to this single, sacred space, to the man she loved. His blood was warm on her hands. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto his, mingling with his blood and the dust. She leaned down, her lips close to his ear, and whispered the words that had become their story. Their prayer. "I have been waiting so long." A faint, beautiful smile touched his lips. He raised his hand, his movement slow, heavy, and his fingers brushed against her cheek in a final, gentle caress. His eyes, filled with a love that was brighter than the sun, held hers for one last, eternal moment. Then his hand fell still, and the light went out. The people of Dry Hollow emerged from their homes later, their faces a mixture of shame, awe, and sorrow. They did not speak to Clara, but their actions spoke for them. They took Eli's body and wrapped it in a clean white sheet. They buried him on a small hill overlooking the town, beneath the shade of a lone mesquite tree, the same kind of tree under which he had shared his deepest wound with her. Clara stayed until the last shovel of dirt was laid upon the grave. Then, without a word to anyone, she went to the livery, took Buster, and rode east, back into the desert that had almost claimed her. The townspeople watched her go, a solitary figure shrinking against the vast, unforgiving landscape. She did not look back. The story of Eli and Clara ended there, in the dust of Dry Hollow. But some say, on nights when the wind blows hard across the plains, you can still hear her voice. It is the voice of a woman forever marked by tragedy, a woman who lost everything she had ever found, but it is also the voice of a woman who carries love through the wasteland, not as a memory or a ghost, but as a living, breathing flame, a light that refuses to die, a defiant testament to a love that was never meant to survive, but did, in its own heartbreaking way, until the very end. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English